we're going to flip the agenda just a tad, because Renee Grassi and Cate Loveday are going to go first.
The mic is never low for me. That's like the first time for everything. Hi everybody, my name is Renee Grassi. I'm the Youth Department Director at the Glen Public Library. I am also very fortunate to be one of the board members of the Targeting Autism Forum and co-facilitator of the SNAILS networking group. SNAILS is a networking group of youth and young adult librarians. We meet quarterly. We also, me along with the co-facilitator, Helen, which you'll hear next, work on development and training for youth and young adult librarians to learn about accessible and inclusive library services.
And my name is Cate Loveday. I'm a youth services librarian at the Helen Plum Library in Lombard, Illinois. I'm also a member of SNAILS. And we are two of the representatives from Group C, which encompasses DuPage, Kane, and Will counties in Illinois. We are here to share our experience and the things that we've been doing over the past year since the last Targeting Autism Forum. So we're happy to share our experience and hope that you can take something to incorporate into your communities as well. So we really encompass the spectrum of library services. We have youth services staff as well as adult services librarians in our group. We have frontline staff and middle management, and we're a mix of public and medical libraries. So that gave us the opportunity to really learn about the two types of libraries and the services that they provide. We also have our sizes of our libraries are very different as well. I think our largest service population represented is Gale Borden with 144,597 service population on their website, and Warrenville is our smallest with 13,336. As well as being advocates in our libraries, some are even parent advocates, and autism is a part of their daily lives.
So what was our plan? Like the last group, we identified our stakeholders in our community. We identified nearly 50 stakeholder organizations in DuPage, Will, and Kane counties. And the list represents a mix of organizations that provide a variety of services to people with autism. Organizations were identified and they represent a variety of service, and each of you have a handout. It's a double-sided Excel type handout listing our organizations, and we group them by the type. So some of the service organization types are therapeutic, recreation, educational, advocacy, employment, support groups, and networking groups. And each one of our group members reached out to these organizations one-on-one, and we focused on services specifically focused on servicing people with autism, but we also tried to reach out to more disability-related organizations that had a broader scope of service. Then we developed 2 questionnaires, and thanks to Targeting Autism for really last year's survey, we used a lot of those questions as our foundation for developing these questionnaires. The first questionnaire was for organizations, and this really focused on finding information about which ages their organizations served, what partnerships they had developed with other organizations, and also assessing gaps of service. And we developed another questionnaire, one for self-advocates and families. And that one focused on what type of autism-related services they themselves or their families are currently receiving. It also assessed current perception of libraries, and it also asked their experience using libraries, as well as a question about how they acquire information about autism. So then, members of our group went out and conducted all of our interviews from April 2015 all the way through to February of this year. And then we met as a group, and it was really great to talk with everybody and figure out and discuss the results and our takeaways. So we compiled the results and developed a stakeholder service spreadsheet, which is the spreadsheet that I was referring to, that each of you have a copy of, which we really hope will be a valuable tool for you and possibly a means for comparison in your own library communities. And we felt that this really became a valuable tool for us. It allowed us to be able to see what gaps in service there potentially were, strengths, and of course there's a lot of information that's not reflected on those sheets, but it was a really valuable process overall for us in assessing our communities and reaching out and developing those partnerships. I think one of the most meaningful takeaways for me was how many people and organizations we reached out to, or I reached out to at my own library. Was just surprised that we were asking these questions. I think, again, talking about perceptions of libraries related to serving people with autism, they didn't even know that this topic was on our radar, and they were really encouraged to know that libraries were doing something to make a significant difference.
So after our meeting in February, we discussed our biggest takeaways from our survey and our responses that we got. So our first is lack of funding. As we know, with the lack of funding, it's difficult to provide or expand services that are offered. Many of the organizations that we were talking to were facing the same challenges. Our second is a lack of transitional services. This is what we deemed our most important takeaway, and we'll be discussing it later in the presentation. We also noticed on our list a lack of early intervention services and a lack of employment and advocacy related organizations, which was troubling because in a time of budgetary crisis as we are in, advocacy is so important. There was no information-only organizations on our list. There was Batavia Public Library told us a story of when they interviewed a parent, and they said that they, for physicians, would sometimes not have accurate or enough information for them. So we were like, that's a perfect opportunity for libraries to get involved and to be that niche, that need in their communities. And many organizations had no previous experience with libraries, so we're hoping that by doing this project and this experience that they can look to libraries to be partners in the future.
So we decided to really focus on transitional services and the lack of them for the sake of time. That's what we are going to focus on today. We felt throughout our conversations in our group, this was really one of the most meaningful takeaways. As we all know, transitional services relate to the services for people with autism who are entering adulthood, and for those purposes, we're defining it as people ages 18 to 22. And in some way, shape, or form, all of our library communities that when we met and we discussed provided really important feedback from our organizations, families and self-advocates about how this specifically was an area that was lacking in their communities. So as we compiled our information and developed our spreadsheet, we observed a significant trend across stakeholder organizations that there was a certain drop-off at a certain age where services were offered. It wasn't across the board, but it definitely was a significant amount. And while this might not be necessarily the most surprising results based on conversations we've had, certainly in this forum, and we've had conversations with our members too, and research, this is an anticipated result and proves to be consistent with what we already know to be true about the state of service for this age group.
So the obstacles for our stakeholders, once again, we noticed funding. It limits to provide or expand services. Staffing for, if you can't staff the services, you can't provide the services. And 2 of our libraries talked about experiences they had where staff prohibited them from expanding services. For example, Mary and Joy had someone from a University of Florida come in and want to add more content to their Information Connections website, but they were unable to do that because of lack of staff. And then also the Gail Borden Library and their Next Chapter Book Club wanted to expand, but lack of staff again prevents them from doing that. and audience. So at this age, in the 18 and older, if they're out of special education services, they might not be self-identifying, and then where do they fit into services?
So throughout our group's discussions, we really came to realize that there were many apparent obstacles for libraries too, who are trying to serve this transitional age group. First of which was existing library policy and procedure could potentially limit the needs of young adults and adults with autism. For example, one example that was discussed in our conversation was age restrictions in terms of access to space in libraries based on using the collections. For example, in a library, you could potentially have an internal procedure or a policy limiting certain age groups from not accessing your library, even if they're interested in using your materials. So that there were actually policies and procedures in place that would inhibit this from happening. Similarly, which department of libraries serve this age group of patrons? And we had a lot of conversations about this, about who takes ownership, who is trained, which department is more welcoming of noise, which staff are more flexible and accommodating. And I think there's an apparent misconception about, in some cases, library staff, if patrons with autism or patrons have a developmental disability, they are best sent to the youth department. And that was apparent. It was a very interesting conversation that came up a lot as well. Certainly, as we're hearing a lot today, a lack of staff training or awareness that could affect librarian staff to have certain misconceptions, maybe using incorrect vocabulary that is potentially offensive even though staff may not know it to be so, and maybe just not common sense or common knowledge information that all of us in this room may know, but our counterparts at our libraries don't. And then there's that fear, potential risk, or extra work. What could go wrong? And this is apparent specifically with the next bullet point, which is an unwillingness to advertise that accommodations can be made at a library. And one of our libraries talked about how it's not that there's necessarily staff unwillingness to by the way, uphold the law to accommodate, but just that we didn't want to advertise it necessarily so that in case it would make more work for staff. And that's a very, very interesting and unexpected perception, but I think fear, just in general, is something that is an obstacle for libraries and is an obstacle for librarians. It's a word that encapsulates a lot with regards to what's different, what's unknown, what's new. And I just think that these are some really interesting obstacles. And then the last one is we've talked about adults who may not self-identify. And as Ann Ford talked about earlier today, some people worry about the stigma of how they will be treated. And so what approach do staff take for those that don't self-identify as having autism? How do they come up with good strategies for customer service? How do they develop programs? Are these more targeted programs? Are these inclusive programs? So there wasn't really an answer to a lot of these questions or these obstacles, but these were definitely some things that we discussed.
Okay, so how can we turn these obstacles into opportunities for libraries? So we came up with some opportunities for libraries to create partnerships, partner with special recreation associations, AIDs, or other local groups to provide outing, space, or outreach services to those with less access, offer volunteer and job opportunities at the libraries, hosting job or volunteer or service fairs to connect individuals with organizations, or to provide space for inclusion and social events for patrons with autism. Many of the libraries in our groups had hosted similar programs like this with great results that were very popular. We also talked about finding that parent advocate that can set you up with their networking groups to really promote the services that you provide, and also thinking outside of your institutions and connect people with autism to the library. And then this is a list of opportunities that you can do on-site in your library. to train staff and provide the best service for those with autism, promote library as a safe and welcoming space, coordinate interdepartmental efforts to provide appropriate materials, space, and services with patrons with autism, and then advertise and make available access to online resources, provide tutorials and assistance for patrons in using online resources, and develop and advertise a request for accommodations form that can be on your website.
So, in addition to opportunities, here are some of our recommendations. I think the first one really is to build relationships, and we've heard this is a common theme today in terms of identifying and reaching out to our local stakeholders, the organizations that are in our communities, and it was an overwhelming response from our group that the organizations we talked to were interested in this project, as I mentioned before. They wanted to help, and they were just overall wonderful people to connect with, like all of you guys here in this room. So, you know, building relationships is key. So go sit at the table, and if you can't fit at the table, bring your own chair. You know, you just have to push on through and build those relationships. Another recommendation is train staff. We talk about this all of the time, building that foundation for your staff members, providing them with the tools and strategies that they need. But not only that, you're really ensuring that the future of the profession is inclusive and welcoming to people with autism too. So even if you're training librarians who have been in the profession for 30 years, or you're training librarians or people that are just right out of library school, these are tools that everybody across the board needs from top to bottom. Develop a plan. Talk to different departments in your library. Talk about what approach your library is taking to serve patrons with autism. Be unified, try not to get siloed, and if something comes up, have that conversation and open your door to figure out what suits the needs of your own library. For those in management in the room, institute top-down change. Do your research, develop and implement inclusive programs and policy and procedure. And for those of you who are not in management, I will say you can lead from any level. You do not have to be in a management position to make and advocate for change in your institution. And then make it a priority. Include this area of service in your library's strategic plan, for example. That's something that we did at the Glen Public Library in 2014. We made it a point in our strategic plan to include serving special populations, specifically those with disabilities, and of course that includes people with autism as a point of service and purpose for our library, and that informed the next 2 years of what we did. And everybody in our library was unified in that. So I think that's a great recommendation. And then, of course, advocate, as we've been hearing all day today. Communicate the needs of patrons with autism to your colleagues at your library, whether that means having a conversation or talking to your boss, or making a recommendation for something that you think is needed in terms of at your library. So each of you have a double-sided handout listing all of the projects that our group members have done. And of course, because of limited time, we couldn't talk about all the wonderful things that each one of our group members has accomplished over this time, but we wanted to make sure that you knew about it. But we also hope that this could prove to be inspiration, information for you, maybe a jumping off point for potential ideas at your own library. But we do want to highlight one amazing thing from each of our group members that each one of our group members has been able to accomplish. Starting at the Glen Public Library, we coordinated an in-depth training, staff training for all youth department staff members about autism-friendly customer service, providing suggestions and strategies for accommodating youth with autism in programs. Cate at the Helen Plum Library has implemented 3 sensory storytime programs and has also developed a partnership with a family therapist for an early intervention playgroup. Diana from the Warrenville Public Library is now the newly appointed library representative at a newly formed Wheaton Warrenville Special Needs PTA group, so yay, Diana. At Marion Joy, Nalini and Jane and their staff conducted a needs assessment survey, and because of that, they have created 30 additional pages of research focusing on transition to adulthood to those with autism. And it's right now in process and will soon be added to the Information Connections website, which you guys will hear more about tomorrow during our program. At the Batavia Public Library, they hosted an inclusion movie night program and game night programs. These were well attended, well received and successful, and these were particularly for older aged people. At the Gale Borden Public Library, Erin hosts Next Chapter Book Club for seniors with developmental disabilities twice a month. And again, she would do it more if she had staff. And she also focuses on developing life skills in that program. And Nancy at the Fountaindale Public Library has developed a partnership with the Lily Cash Special Recreation Association for visits to the library, and particularly developing programs on cultural cuisine.
And we just want to say thank you to the Targeting Autism for having this forum. This process has inspired us to and challenge us to grow as librarians, professionals, and as, most importantly, people. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to share with all of you today. Thank you.